Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne Bates. Welcome to our virtual tour of our virtual Executive Presence program. Good to have you with us. I'd like to introduce a few members of our team. Scott Weigert, our Director of Learning, Andy Atkins, our SVP of Research, Innovation, and Practice, Chris Goodnow on our marketing team, Megan McGrath, Director of Marketing, and Roanne Neuwirth, our VP of Marketing. And the three of them are going to act today as our team or our audience as we show you what it's like to experience our EP Mastery program. And a lot of people wonder, what is executive presence anyway? And we like to create a lot of interactivity in our program, so we're going to start right off with a poll. And I'm going to ask you this question. How do people use the phrase executive presence in your organization? And panelists, I'm going to ask you to vote, all right? We have a scientific model that explains exactly what that means. People throw it around, but I doubt anybody could define it. It's vague, seems to mean different things to different people, or that phrase doesn't come up very often here. All right, go ahead and vote now, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, so most of this panel said we have a scientific model, of course, because we do at Bates. But very often, these are some of the other answers we hear when we talk about executive presence, and that's precisely why we developed the Executive Presence program we're going to talk about today. And I think the poll answers underscore why it is so important to define executive presence in your organization. So for starters, what we thought we'd do is talk about that scientific model of executive presence that's based on research. Andy, why don't you take us through first how we define executive presence?
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Now, one of those answers was people kind of throw the word of executive presence around, but nobody can really define it. And so what we did at Bates a few years ago was bring together a group of industrial psychologists to really scan the waterfront. What was the emerging thinking around executive presence? Because in the work that we were doing with senior executives, we heard mention of it, but nobody could really define it. About the best they could do is say, well, I kind of know it when I see it, or it's gravitas or something like that. But we found that there is a very, very specific way that we can understand whether or not an executive has executive presence. And that definition is that executive presence are the qualities of a leader as viewed by others that engage, inspire, align, and move people to act. And that as viewed by others is the important part, because executive presence, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. It's a matter of the experience that others have of what you are doing rather than your intention as you're trying to come across. Now, going further than that, we identified 15 different areas that were critical to this, and they break out into three broad categories. There's character, which enhances the trust that people have. There's substance, which increases the leader's credibility, and style, which is how they engage others. And as you look down the list here, you'll find that there are a number of qualities here that, if you're like most leaders that we talk to, intuitively make a lot of sense to you about being important factors in whether a leader has executive presence.
And Andy, if I may, a lot of people ask, how is it possible to measure things like integrity or concern? Because we actually produce a 90-page report with data for each leader who completes the assessment.
Yes, thanks, Suzanne. And that really comes down to the fact that we're looking at specific leadership behaviors, and behaviors can be measured. This isn't a matter of the leader's intent or their mindset. We're looking at specifically what do they do, and then we've mapped 90 different specific behaviors, 6 each, to those 15 facets that we just saw in the model.
So before we go on and talk about the program, Megan, Roanne, I know you guys have both completed an assessment. What was it like to get data on that kind of leadership quality that we measure?
One of the things that comes up a lot is leaders are nervous to get feedback and results typically in any situation, but particularly in the context of an assessment. I found, however, that it was helpful to hear what people wanted to see more of from me. For example, in my feedback, a lot of people said that they wanted to have me speak up in meetings more or hear my opinion more. And so that's something that I could work on that wasn't necessarily negative. So I think that kind of feedback surprises people a lot in this program.
So we do individual feedback before you come to the executive presence program. And Roanne, I know we do focus a lot on our gaps or negatives, but were you surprised at some of the positives in your report as well?
Well, definitely. And as Megan said, it was very nerve-wracking. And, you know, as always being a type A, wanting to be at the head of the class, it was very stressful. But I was surprised too at some of the places that were positive that I might have, in fact, rated myself much lower. And it was interesting. And I did find the specificity of the behaviors to be very helpful in figuring out sort of what does this mean and what I should do with it.
So after you get your feedback, you come to the executive presence program, but not before you do a little bit of work ahead of time, Scott. And the reason for that is we want to make sure the class is really interactive. So tell us a little bit about how you get ready to come to an EP Mastery program.
Sure, Suzanne. So as Roanne described, before Roanne came to the program, she got that lengthy report, but we also give people a couple useful tools to help them make sense of that report, because otherwise you can really end up swimming in all that data. So we give people a user's guide to make sense of it, which I think especially the more analytical, like the finance and supply chain folks, love that kind of stuff because it gives them a real linear process they can follow to go step by step and make sense of what's in that report. And we also ask people to do a developmental summary worksheet, which is a way to crystallize what you've learned by going through the user's guide and making sense of that document. And then you would have a 75-minute insights conversation with someone on the Bates team, someone like Andy or me. And we would have that be, I think people expect, Suzanne, coming in, that that's going to be a lot of listening, that we're going to be reading something from a manual about them while you're high in authenticity or aware, this is what this means. And it's really not like that at all. It's more of a dialogue about it, where we talk about general reactions. Gee, Roanne, what did you make of this at a 30,000-foot level? Look at your strengths. How do those connect to the business goals you need to accomplish? And then let's dig into some of those things that maybe could be a bit stronger. So I think people are often surprised at not only how much of a conversation it is, but it leads to specific, concrete, actionable steps people can take to move the needle very quickly on this topic of executive presence.
So Andy, we talk a lot about leveraging your strengths, and I wonder if you can explain what we mean by that in the context of the Executive Presence Mastery Program.
So in terms of leveraging strengths, Suzanne, maybe one way to address that is to show you something that we do in the program. So let's bring up the character facet in the model. And what I'm going to ask our team members here, the participants, to do is to use your annotation tool and put a star next to the two character facets that are your personal strengths. So bring those up, and let's get a couple of seconds here to get these tapped on. There we go. And give you a chance to put a couple more in there. All right. Well, one of the things that we noticed here is that we've got 3 responses in authenticity. So that seems to be a strength that we have in common. And I'm curious, Megan, how does authenticity come through as a strength? How does that come through as important in your leadership and your presence?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Andy, because we also did some research on intergenerational leadership in the workplace, and authenticity is something that really resonates with millennials in particular. So it's not surprising with 2 millennials and a leader of a team leading millennials that we're seeing a lot of authenticity here today. But I think that with authenticity, it's a what you see is what you get, just being kind of your authentic self in the workplace.
Now, in addition to thinking about a strength, sometimes you can have too much of a good thing, or what we think of as an overstrength. And I'm curious, Roanne, do you have any reflections on what an overstrength in authenticity might look like?
Well, yes, and actually, I certainly have seen it at play. You know, one thing is a leader can run the risk of dominating the conversation, maybe oversharing, being a little too candid sometimes.
Huh? Kind of a little bit TMI, if you will, too much information. So Suzanne, you can see that strengths are an important tool that leaders can draw on in developing that sense of presence that we're talking about.
Andy, a lot of people wonder when they sign up for a virtual learning session whether it'll have the same kind of feeling you have when you're all together in a classroom. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things to think about here in terms of the way that we do virtual better. This is not a situation where you're sitting back and passively watching somebody go through a bunch of PowerPoint slides. This is an interactive and even intimate dialogue that people have. And one of the things that we really look for are opportunities for people to have ongoing engagement throughout the entire session. In fact, some people have mentioned that in a virtual environment, they even have more opportunities to share their thoughts and ideas than they had in the classroom. You don't have to wait your turn when you have a chat box that you can share ideas in. And one of the things that we've also found is that the camera actually gives us the ability to be a little bit closer to each other and really get that sense of exchange with each other. Whereas when we're in a classroom, we're all kind of looking at the front and not really looking at each other. And it really gives us a chance to have some really intimate and engaging dialogue with each other.
All right, so I'm going to go around the horn and just ask a few more questions on our virtual tour. And Chris, I'm curious, what do you think is the best way to compare a classroom experience with a virtual learning experience like the one we offer in Executive Presence Mastery?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people really enjoy about the virtual experience compared to the in-person experience is it gives people a little bit more of a chance to interact and engage with the group without having that nervous sense of I'm in person and I might say the wrong thing here. With things like polls that people can interact with and share their opinions candidly, things like breakout rooms where you can mute yourself and engage when the time is right and kind of sit back and think in your own thoughts if you need to before blurting out an answer. So I think people really like to have that aspect of I can sit back in my chair, think about my thoughts, and share with the group when I'm ready, as opposed to the in-person experience.
Yeah. Megan, a lot of participants worry or wonder about doing homework before a session like this. What do you think is the value of it, and how arduous is it really?
Yeah, well, with this particular session, I think it's really important to have some time to reflect on your own before you participate with the group, and really think about where do I want to take my career? What could I do to enhance my presence that would just make my team more effective or the organization more effective? And, you know, it's good to do that together and separately. So that's part of the power of this.
Roanne, as you reflect, I know it's been a couple of years since you've completed the assessment. As you reflect on what's happened since then, how, without revealing too much, has it changed how you think about yourself as a leader or how you lead?
Well, it really was a great reflection point when I did go through that. And I think that over the years, I've had threads of the conversations that I had even at the program. I still remember the group after the emotion of the wisdom sharing and sharing a couple of stories, and those stories sometimes still pop into my head. And I think how it's impacted me as a leader, that it's really made me more intentional and thoughtful about what I might have done in the past instinctively, either good or bad, that it's made me much more deliberate about what I need to do to make sure that people feel engaged and feel empowered and see the vision.
Scott, you've probably had thousands at this point of conversations with leaders, providing them with constructive feedback, and I know you do that with great care. What would you say is the most common experience people share with you after they've completed the XPI assessment and received the information?
Well, I always say probably 85% of people, when they first get their feedback and you ask for that general reaction, they're going to focus on whatever small portion of the glass is empty rather than the considerable portion is full. But I think the biggest change that happens is over the course of 75 minutes, it's really fun to talk people off the ledge a little bit sometimes and make sure they don't overlook the considerable strengths they have. I mean, we're dealing with smart, experience-driven people who are perfectionists, and that's a great thing, but that can cut a couple different ways. So I think we're good at, collectively, all the Bates coaches, at getting people to take a little stock, be a bit more balanced in how we look at things, and then dig into specifically, where am I not coming across quite as well as I might like, with whom and in what situations, and most importantly, what can I do about it to have all the impact that I can possibly have as a leader. So I think at the end, people are often surprised that it felt more personal than they expected, it felt more relevant, and it gave them some things they could do right off the bat, and things weren't quite as bad as they imagined when they first looked at the report.
So Megan, what are some of the other aspects of virtual that really work?
Well, I think virtual takes into account all different learning styles. So one that we hear a lot is introverts, extroverts, right? That we set the program up so that introverts feel encouraged to participate in some of the ways that Chris was mentioning through maybe some more passive participation, or they can take the time that they need to think and process their ideas before they present them to the group. That definitely helps with engagement. Another thing that's really key here is a lot of organizations have high potential leaders from all different parts of the world. And I think that it helps kind of mitigate cultural barriers and create a sense of inclusivity and feedback from others in the group that's helpful to people who have different learning styles, different backgrounds, and all of those sorts of things.
Those are all great points. Thanks to all of you, and thank you for joining us. If you're interested in attending one of our Executive Presence Mastery programs or bringing the program into your organization, please get in touch with us at info@bates-communications.com. Thanks, everybody.